All right, I think we're going to get started. So good afternoon and welcome to Betrayed by the Bishops, Catholics Speak Out. My name is Marley Breakstone and I'm the Domestic Program Associate here at Catholics for Choice. In this role, I promote and strengthen pro-choice Catholic advocacy in the United States, focusing on outreach, recruitment, and engagement of our activist network. Catholics for Choice is a nonprofit organization that lifts up the voices of the majority of Catholics who believe in reproductive freedom. We know that Catholics in the US and around the world are pro-choice because of their faith, not in spite of it, and we fight to protect the right to abortions for all who need them. As you've probably seen in the news recently, the US Conference of Catholic Bishops chose to continue its attacks on President Biden and other pro-choice Catholics by voting to proceed with drafting a formal statement on the meaning of communion. Make no mistake, these actions are unprecedented and do not represent how Catholics like us really feel. The American bishops are acting like they're more Catholic than the Pope and more political than politicians, with the ultimate goal of excluding President Biden and other pro-choice Catholic elected officials from the Eucharist, despite the objections of many of their own brother bishops, the Vatican, and the overwhelming majority of faithful Catholics in the pews. This is the second webinar in our Lunch and Learn series that will be held through the end of the year. Each month, we'll convene to discuss pro-choice Catholicism and abortion advocacy. Last time, we learned about Catholic healthcare and the community impact of hospital mergers. Today, we'll be discussing the Eucharist and the American bishops' most recent efforts to weaponize it against pro-choice Catholic politicians. Before we get started, let's go over some general logistics and housekeeping rules. Since this is a Zoom webinar, you'll be unable to chat and turn on your video, but you'll also be able to access the Q&A function. So if you have any questions for the 20-minute Q&A that we'll be having at the end, please submit your questions through that function and we will hold them and answer them at the end of the webinar. My colleague Tinsley will be running things on the back end and will be moderating the chat throughout the presentation. So please remember to be nice to Tinsley, and I'll remind you that Catholics care about our neighbors and truth and respect and integrity, and nothing less will be tolerated in that space. This webinar will be recorded and will be sent out to those registered later this week and will also be available on YouTube. And now with all that out of the way, let's get on to the cool stuff. So continue our Lunch and Learn webinar series, I'm now pleased to present Betrayed by the Bishops, Catholics Speak Out. Today, you'll be hearing from three awesome panelists. First is Jamie L. Manson, the president of Catholics for Choice. For over a decade, Jamie has been a thought leader and advocate in the field of women's equality and reproductive rights in the Catholic Church and the public square. For 12 years, she was a columnist at the National Catholic Reporter, where she was one of the few openly LGBTQ journalists in the Catholic media in the world. Jamie's expertise in Catholicism and sexual ethics was first informed during her Master of Divinity Studies at Yale with her mentor, Margaret Farley. Her columns have led to interviews with CBS News, MSNBC, NPR, and her commentary has been quoted in the New York Times. She was also recently published in the Washington Post, and the LA Times, and the Philly Inquirer, and the Daily Beast, and BuzzFeed, and Rewire News, and she has a lot of cool awards. Next, you'll hear from Marianne Duddy-Burke. Marianne is the Executive Director of Dignity USA, the nation's foremost progressive organization of Catholics committed to justice, equality, and full inclusion of LGBTQI people in our church and society. She's also served as Dignity USA's president and was the first woman ever elected to that post. Marianne has more than 35 years experience in leadership positions in both nonprofit and corporate organization, and is a current speaker at the national and regional conferences and has represented Dignity in over 2,500 media stories, covering print, radio, television, and online media. She has written for the New York Times, the National Catholic Reporter, the Advocate, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, and numerous other publications. And in January 2020, Marianne was honored by the National LGBTQ Task Force as one of the 20 faith leaders most responsible for clearing spaces. Then lastly, you'll hear from Glenn Northern, the Domestic Program Director here at Catholics for Choice. Glenn leads and implements our US activities and directs our Catholics in the Public Life Project, a nonpartisan public education initiative that helps Catholic policymakers in the US articulate pro-choice positions. Grounded in progressive Catholicism and sound public policy, Glenn manages our relationships with American policymakers, abortion providers, and religious and secular activists and partner organizations to inform and influence debates on sexual and reproductive health and rights, social justice, and religious liberty. And before joining CFC, Glenn led constituency building and advocacy efforts at Planned Parenthood Federation of America and the Religious Coalition of Reproductive Choice. It is a mouthful when we have such cool people on these webinars, but I'm not complaining. And with that, Jamie, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you so much, Marley. I'm so happy to be here with two good and long friends of mine, Marianne and Glenn. And thank you, Marley and Tinsley, for doing all the hard work to get us here today. I'm going to start by speaking about the issue that we wanted to avoid, I think, throughout this whole fracas with the bishops, which is abortion, essentially. Even progressive Catholics, many of them are afraid to touch this issue. And until we really engage it and we dialogue about it with the gift of reason that God has given us, we are going to continue to have these sorts of problems with the bishops. And so I think it's very important to engage the issue. So that's what I'm going to try to do today. And then I'm going to set it in context, which is namely that Joe Biden is a pro-choice Catholic, and he is a faithful Catholic. He goes to Mass at least once a week, and he supports abortion rights. Now, he is in very good company among the elected officials and the general Catholic population. The majority of Catholics in Congress are also pro-choice. 76 members of the House and 13 members of the Senate are Catholic and pro-choice. This latest move by the bishops to try to deny communion would affect all of those people. And some of these members of Congress are not only Catholics who go to Mass regularly, some of them are even Eucharistic ministers. They participate in a very rich way in the life of the church. Now, pro-choice Catholic members are in very good company with the rest of the population and with their constituents. There are 70 million Catholics in the United States. And according to the most recent Pew survey, 68% of Catholics do not want to see Roe versus Wade struck down. 56% believe abortion should be legal in all or more cases. And 67% of Catholics across party lines do not support denying communion to any Catholic elected official who supports reproductive rights. Many of these Catholics, myself included, believe in the right to abortion care, not in spite of being Catholic, but because we are Catholic. As Catholics, we believe in the primacy of conscience, which teaches that we must use God's gift of reason in all ethical discernment, and that individual conscience is the final arbiter in all moral decision-making. As Catholics, we also have this rich social justice tradition. We believe in the preferential option for the poor, which means that caring for the well-being of the most disadvantaged must always be our first priority. Access to abortion care is deeply intertwined with and exacerbated by systemic racism, by economic insecurity, and by immigration status. For these reasons, Catholics, like Mr. Biden, who have a strong commitment to social justice and human dignity, believe in protecting abortion access. This wedding of anti-abortion identities with Catholic identity is a very recent thing, only in the past few decades. It is not a reflection of the Catholic faith, much as my naysayers on Twitter like to say that being anti-choice does not make you Catholic, and being Catholic does not mean you have to be anti-choice. The truth is the right wing uses the issue of abortion to animate a small segment of the population to pursue an extreme conservative agenda that seeks to take away civil rights from women, from LGBTQ people, and other vulnerable populations. Sadly, some of the US bishops have lost influence over their own flocks, and they are choosing to participate in as far-right political operatives. And that is what we saw a few weeks ago. And To my surprise, even, we saw bishops, more progressive bishops, actually acknowledge that this was a purely political move having to do with 2022 and 2024. But nevertheless, the abortion issue is used and exploited to amass political power by a faction of largely white privileged people who have proven they do not truly care about protecting life outside the womb. This was made abundantly clear when right-wing Catholics invited Donald Trump to be the keynote speaker at the March for Life. This is a man who showed cynical disregard for life in the way he treated immigrants, in the way he treated the earth, in the way he treated people on death row, among others. So it is glaringly hypocritical for the bishops to suddenly use their voice to condemn President Biden and other Catholic elected officials whose consciences compel them to support abortion rights. It is essential in this moment that pro-choice Catholics and other pro-choice people of faith take control of the narrative. The bishops know that they do not have the support of the laity on this issue. They know that they have lost influence over their own people. So they have turned to using something very sacred to President Biden to bully him into compromising on his pro-choice values. Although the bishops and right-wing Catholics are a minority, they always have the loudest voice on this issue. And so for this reason, a vocal display of unity among pro-choice Catholics and the religious left and people of faith is so essential at this moment. We must claim the moral high ground in this fight. Pro-choice Catholics and other people of faith must speak about their values using the language of social justice, the primacy of individual conscience, and this is about the defense of freedom, equality, and democracy. Catholics for Choice has done some opposition research around the bishops' meeting. And what we have gleaned so far from legislative agencies in our research reveals that in just 7 states, in the space of less than 7 years, it's between 2014 and 2021, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops spent between $10 and $11 million on lobbying. Let me say that again. In just 7 states in 7 years, they spent between $10 and $11 million on their lobbying efforts. The USCCB's press statements and their social media make it clear that these lobbying efforts were less concerned with defending the poor and marginalized, and instead were aimed at blocking legislation that would allow for abortion care or equal rights for LGBTQ people or justice for sex abuse victims. Faithful church-going Catholics would no doubt be brokenhearted, if not deeply angry, to hear that this is how their donations, their hard-earned money, was being spent in such unjust ways. We have a church hierarchy that wishes to spend its time and money trying to erode civil rights of Americans through their lobbying and through their litigation. We've seen it for years now in the Supreme Court, most recently in the Fulton versus Philadelphia case. The point is that as a Catholic myself who loves her faith, who looks to the tradition or to our sacramental theology and our social justice teaching to give my life meaning, I do not want to see my faith used in this way. And I think the majority of Catholics don't either. But in order to do this, in order to fight back, we, the religious progressives and the religious left, have got to get loud. And we have got to stop this right-wing movement from amassing power. They are not interested in protecting life. They have proven that time and again. This is about using an issue to amass political power. It's dangerous, and to be quite honest, it's putting our democracy itself in jeopardy. I'll stop there and move to, is it Marianne?
Thanks, Jamie.
Sure.
Powerful words, and thanks to everybody at Catholics for Choice, our longtime colleagues on issues of conscience and the ways in which Catholicism intersects with public policy. Thanks for having me here. Thanks to everybody who's turning in live or who will watch this recording. Your commitment to the very issues that Jamie was just talking about is so important and so very much needed. It's clear that this is a really timely discussion. The issue of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which I'll also be calling USCCB or the Bishops' Conference, actively debating a document that would ban President Biden and presumptively many other Catholic politicians who do not vote as the Bishops' Conference wants them to from communion has been much in the news, and I think has been confusing to a lot of people. But I have to say, as horrific and disturbing as the debate is, I do take one bit of hope from it. I believe that the blatant attempt to use our church's most significant sacrament against our very publicly Catholic president, who's made it clear that he supports policies that are not those promoted to USCCB, especially, but not only on reproductive rights and LGBTQ equality, that this attack is a sign that the USCCB is terrified of the strength and the depth of the progressive religious movement. As underfunded, as expansive, and as disorganized as we are, we still represent the majority of people of faith in this country. And as has been said already a couple times, we do so because of and not in spite of our faith. While this message is not yet fully understood by the populace, the bishops clearly get it, and they are clearly running scared. So I'm going to cut to the chase and tell you the main point of my remarks right now. The USCCB has no business whatsoever claiming to represent the Catholic voting population of the US when it lobbies in Congress or in state houses across our country, or when it claims to represent us in court, especially when the issue has to do with anything that revolves around gender, sexuality, family structure, or conscience. Let me put it another way. The bishops are consistently deceiving public officials and misrepresenting Catholicism as it is practiced in the US. They're painting us as wedded, pardon the pun, to a vision of humanity that is essentially biological determinism, where biological females and biological males have distinct, divinely ordained roles that complement each other, that are ordered towards the production and rearing of children, and that assume a male dominance over the feminine. For decades, the USCCB and other radically conservative religious leaders have sought to order not just their own religious spheres, but society in accordance with this gender-based fantasy world under the rubric of religious liberty or religious freedom. Despite being overrepresented in the halls of power, wealth, education, Catholic leaders have depicted themselves as a persecuted class, under attack by liberals, feminists, queers, and although they don't generally say it overtly, people of color. They've co-opted a central value of our democracy and pluralistic society, that of ensuring that the government not prioritize one faith over any others, and of ensuring that every individual's right to worship or not as they believe, as a rallying cry to protect and promote a social order that is opposed by their own believers. One of the latest examples of how this has played out and its impact on the broader society is the Fulton versus City of Philadelphia case, which Jamie mentioned. The Supreme Court handed down its decision in this case in late June. Briefly, the City of Philadelphia was refusing to renew its contract with Catholic Social Services of Philadelphia for providing foster care and adoption services because the agency refused to abide by the non-discrimination laws that required it to consider same-sex couples for licensure. Catholic Social Services claimed that the city was violating its religious liberty by requiring it to include same-sex couples, which the agency saw as an endorsement of marriage equality. This case is emblematic of a practice that has been going on for decades at Catholic and some other faith-based foster and adoption providers. And in the interest of full disclosure, is a response my spouse and I experienced when we were denied the opportunity to apply for foster care licensure through Catholic Charities of Boston in 2002. Across the country, Catholic social service agencies have stopped providing these services or have applied for exemptions to non-discrimination laws with varying success. Earlier this year, Bethany Christian Services, the largest evangelically oriented foster and adoption care agency, announced that it would no longer ban LGBTQ+ individuals or same-sex couples from applying to provide services. How this will play out is being carefully monitored. So the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Catholic social services in this case, but it was on very narrow technical grounds. Because the city's contract contained an exemption clause, the court ruled that the contract's provisions were not equally enforceable, and therefore religious issues could have been at play in this situation. However, very importantly, the court upheld the right of states and municipalities to have and to enforce non-discrimination laws as long as they do so evenly across the board. So despite the headlines declaring a unanimous defeat for hopeful LGBTQ+ foster and adoptive parents, that's not what happened. Here, however, and if screen sharing works, you'll be able to read this. This is the USCCB's response to the ruling, which they tout as protecting the freedom to serve. So I encourage folks to watch for that rhetoric in the months ahead. It's the first time we've heard that phrase, but I don't think it's going to be the last. And unfortunately, I'm having trouble with screen sharing. So I'll just read you the ruling and try to highlight, or sorry, I will read you the USCCB response to the ruling and highlight the critical parts. USCCB said, quote, "Americans have long been a tolerant people who respect each other's deepest differences. Yesterday, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld that tradition, reinvigorating the First Amendment's promise that religious believers can bring the full vitality of their faith to their charitable service and to the public square." Pay attention to this next session. "This is a victory for the common good and for thousands of children who rely on foster care and adoption agencies to find a loving home with a mother and a father, which is their right." They went on to say, "We are grateful the ruling recognizes our witness in our works of mercy and God's plan for the family. We Catholics must continue to practice what we preach. Let us show all our neighbors the truth of our beliefs by their beauty when they are put into action." That is the end of their statement. So given that 65% of Hispanic Catholics and 80% of white Catholics in the US oppose allowing publicly funded religious institutions to discriminate against LGBTQ+ people, this is what the USCCB, not Catholics at large, believe and preach. So pardon my cynicism, but I have to wonder to what extent this is about preserving a very lucrative revenue stream rather than serving children. I'd also ask you to consider that 1/3 of children in foster care identify as queer, and 1/4 are children of color. And look at those things alongside the fact that same-sex couples are 7 times more likely than opposite-sex couples to foster or adopt. They're more likely to adopt transracially, to have older children, to have LGBTQ children, to have special needs children, or anybody that is hard to place. So it really seems that excluding potential LGBTQ+ parents decreases the ability of children in state custody to find stable and loving homes. We know that USCCB is using legislation and the courts to promote its complementarity doctrine in many other ways as well, sacrificing the well-being and perhaps even the lives of many vulnerable people in so doing. They have filed several court cases to protect their exemption from employment laws in various states and nationally, meaning that employees at Catholic schools, health providers, service agencies, and churches generally lack any legal protection and can be fired for what their employers deem to be moral indiscretions, or even for falling ill or getting old. USCCB is working tirelessly to position themselves as champions of women and children in their fight against the Equality Act, stoking fears that women will be attacked by men dressed as women and that girls will lose access to sports programs if the rights of transgender and non-binary individuals are upheld. They have also come out against renewal of the Violence Against Women Act and recently fought passage of a nationwide 3-digit suicide prevention lifeline because both of these measures contain provisions and funding for the LGBTQ+ community. The Bishops' Conference has outsized influence on Capitol Hill and in our state houses across the country. They are misrepresenting the beliefs of Catholic voters and trying to use the democratic process to protect denominational doctrine. This is wrong. It unfairly impacts the lives of Catholics and non-Catholics throughout the US and beyond, and it needs to stop. It is time for the progressive Catholic majority on these issues to become more explicitly engaged as people of faith, more vocal about what our church's social justice teachings and our consciences demand, and more willing to be clear about the wide chasm between what USCCB proclaims and what Catholics actually believe and want from public policy. To say more on these issues, I turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Glenn.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Thank you, Jamie. As you've heard my colleagues and friends sort of elaborate on the ways in which the bishop's agenda really is out of line with our own Catholic teaching and really is not what the lay Catholics, regular everyday Catholics want to see. As a Black Catholic, I implore the bishops, bread, not stones. We are asking for compassion and care, not cruelty and callousness. Catholic respect for human dignity demands incompatibility with racism. Racism is anathema to our faith's teaching about social justice. And this is why, as a Black Catholic, I cannot help but be disappointed and feel a bit betrayed by the bishops' relative silence on issues of race amidst their fixation with ending abortion and taking away LGBT rights. My brothers and sisters are literally choking on the racism that surrounds us, and they remain silent in ivory towers. That is not the Catholic social justice I learned growing up. Where were your voices over the past year when my sisters and brothers took to the streets to protest the latest murders and injustices visited upon Black and brown people through the legacy of unchecked racism? Where were your voices as our communities sought healthcare, including reproductive healthcare, in order to take care of ourselves and our families during the pandemic? Where were the bishops' voices as civil and voting rights are stripped from Black and brown communities? When did political expediency and partisanship supplant genuine listening, caring, and care for community? My parish priest growing up in the church I was a part of and was an altar boy in upstate New York was an older Irish Catholic priest who had formerly served the Black community in a church in Harlem. He was wise, loving, generous. He made my family, the only Black family in our little church, feel at home. He was not afraid to speak about race. He was not afraid to talk about racism. He talked about his involvement in the civil rights movement. I learned about social justice, Catholic social justice, in that environment. Now I work at Catholics for Choice, lifting up the voices of Catholics who believe that each of us is made in the image of God and capable of exercising our conscience to make important moral decisions about who to love, the size and shape of our families. Racism undergirds policies that in effect obstruct Black and Brown communities disproportionately from accessing reproductive health care and other services. At Catholics for Choice, we strive to live out Catholic social justice teachings, advocating for Black and Brown communities and any who are relegated to society's margins to have access to reproductive health care. The US bishops' failings around carrying out our social justice teachings sadly extend beyond their silence to standing up against racism. As you heard Marianne speak about their opposition to the Violence Against Women Act, as well as their sort of quiet opposition to the suicide hotline. In fact, Marianne had a fantastic piece in the National Catholic Reporter, which we'll drop in the chat, about this very issue. This is not what Catholics want to see. The cruelty inherent in such acts defies belief. This is certainly not the social justice I learned growing up. We are called as Catholics to love and serve, especially those who struggle the most, period. It is repugnant to oppose legislation that offers a lifeline to youth struggling to value their own life, or to work against legislation that makes concrete improvements for individuals being abused by their partners. Indeed, Catholics all over are both heartsick and livid when they learn about how the bishops are spending their money on lobbying efforts. This is not how we want the bishops spending the money. Catholics want the bishops to be more pastoral and less political. We have suffered enough. As bishops, you have a role to play in eliminating racism, fostering equality, and creating justice. But it will require you to take a deep, hard look at the browning faces of Catholicism and honor the lived experiences of the people of our church. And with that, I think we will move to Marley, who will help us with the question and answer portion of the webinar.
Thank you all so much for those thoughtful remarks. We've been getting some good questions, so I will jump right in. The first question could be for any of you who has an answer that you'd like to share. Can you recall the first time that you ever received communion, or a time when you did as a child, and what did that mean to you?
Go ahead, Marianne, do you want to go?
Oh. You know, I certainly remember my first communion day and those of many others. I mean, I grew up in a family that was Catholic by origin on both sides, and every family event, whether it was a communion, a baptism, a wedding, a confirmation, a funeral, they all revolved around the sacramental life in our church. And you know, I remember being dressed in the white dress and the little veil and all of that. And finally feeling when I got communion that I had sort of joined the ranks of the church for good. You know, I didn't understand at that point in my life the importance of baptism. And for me, you know, seeing everybody go up to communion and the kids being left in the pew was a real demarcation line. And I think that it fostered in me a real sense of responsibility to the community that I was a part of, as well as sort of, that sense of sort of joining the ranks of the adults in the church. And it remains, you know, a source of nourishment and motivation, and something that I am grateful to do in community every opportunity that I have.
Thanks, Marianne. I remember my first communion also like it was yesterday. I too had to wear the little bridal gown and the gloves and the tiara and whatever it was. And all I wanted was to get out of that dress because I was such a tomboy. I couldn't bear it. But even more deeply than that, in advance of my first communion, my mother was married, had divorced my father, and had remarried outside of the church. And we didn't have a lot of money, and she really wanted to receive communion at my first Holy Communion. And she asked our priest out on Long Island, can I receive just for my daughter's first communion? And he said, absolutely not. You are excommunicated. And she said, what can I do? Well, you can get an annulment. Now, at the time, the annulments were very, very expensive. My mother did not have the money. And so my first Holy Communion memory is quite painful because my mother was the only parent who did not come forward for communion at that Mass. And I remember turning around, we received first, then all the parents got up. And I remember turning around and I see my mother on her knees. And it was the first time I saw my mother look ashamed. And it was I can still see her face to this day. And I think that's why this story is so powerful for me about Biden, because I know the shame and the agony that causes. And to have that be my introduction to the church, of my mother being starved from it while I was supposedly being fed by it. I think it was the start of my vocation of what I've done for the rest of my life, honestly.
Thank you so much for sharing that. The next question falls pretty well as a follow-up. Again, any of you who feel moved to can answer. So what would you do if you walked into church next Sunday and you were denied communion?
That is a very, very tough question. I'm going to break it into sort of what I wish I would do and what I think I would do. The wish would be to make it known how hurtful this truly is publicly, in the ways that Jamie just spoke about, because the sacrament of the Eucharist is a sacrament that's supposed to bring us together. It's a sacrament that's it's not supposed to divide us. It's a gift from God. It is. So the idea that the bishops want to exclude people from this holy sacrament really is so incredibly problematic and hurtful. That's what I wish. So I wish that I would probably speak up and be public about that. What I would be likely to do is sit back and not do anything publicly in church, but I think it absolutely fuels this work that I do in the rest of my life, because I think there are many ways in which, there are only 300 or so active bishops in the country, and there's more than 70 million Catholics. And the vast majority of those 70 million Catholics think much more closely to the way I think about these social issues, and feel like the bishops are betraying them on these issues of the sacraments, on LGBT issues, on reproductive health and rights. We want to take care of the people in our community, Black and brown people, the people who are struggling to have their ends meet. That is what we are called to do as Catholics, and the bishops are leaving us behind.
Well, I'm still so deeply moved by Jamie's story of First Communion, and just how painful it is to watch your family be divided in that way. And the fact that there are leaders in our church, whether at a diocesan level or at a parish level, who still think that this is a good idea. It's unthinkable in a lot of ways. I mean, I have certainly been in churches where a priest will say from the altar that if you are in a same-sex marriage, or if you are in a same-sex relationship, if you have had an abortion, if you are divorced and remarried, you know, and they kind of go down a litany of the gravest sins, please do not present yourself for communion. And I've proceeded to take communion anywhere. And fortunately, in none of those cases, although my knees were shaking and I was really worried about what would happen, but, you know, I was always given communion. I have also been at services where people did not present themselves for communion, and I have watched and I have joined as other people went and fed them, which I think is a marvelous response to that happening. Again, I feel like this is so connected as a conscience issue. You know, if you believe you're in right relationship with God, if you believe that you need the sustenance and the nurturing that being part of the Eucharist brings, by all means, accept it. And if you see someone in need, feed them.
Thank you. The next question we will ask to Jamie. Do you think that any other faith would ever do anything like this? And if not, why is the USCCB acting alone?
You know, I can't speak for other faiths and what they would or would not do. I went to a Protestant divinity school where I studied with 40 different kinds of people from 40 different denominations. I never got the sense that might happen. I think certainly Mormons will deny people sacraments. Some of the more conservative ones will, but I think the reason it's important with the Catholic Church, the fact that they're playing such a political role, is really important to look at, because a lot of people say to me, what does it matter? Who cares about the church? That ship, you know, that I don't, you know, I don't let them get to me anymore. I left that. Well, that's fine, but it's really a luxury to be able to walk away. You know, the fact of the matter is that the Catholic hierarchy has enormous power over policy and over law, and not just in the US, but globally. You know, we often say Catholics for choice, the 1 in 6 hospital beds is owned by the church. So they have tried to be, you know, insert themselves, you know, as very influential in the political process and in the legal process. I think that's part of why they're acting this way, honestly. And I do think that, unfortunately, especially in the US, there are some very, very wealthy right-wing Catholics who want to see this happen. And I think bishops rely on their money. And I think there's a lot of pressure, you know, to take these very political stances. But it all ties back to the disproportionate power that that US bishops and bishops globally and the Vatican have over healthcare, public policy, court cases. So I think that's where the really important issue is here.
Thank you, Jamie. The next question was just submitted. We can direct it at Glenn. So how do we attack the erroneous opinions of fellow Catholics, and what can you give us to help us act on the parish level?
Well, I'm going to ask for help on this one too from my colleagues here, but I think it's a lot of your own work, Marley, around sort of, we need to make it known as progressive faith, people of faith, as Catholics, that, as Marianne said earlier, that the bishops do not represent the voices of the majority of Catholics on issues related to conscience, on issues related to LGBT rights, on issues related to reproductive health and rights, on issues related to religion in the public sphere. They simply are, you know, they will walk into the halls of power and say that they speak for Catholics, but that is not true at all. So I think every time an individual, takes an action alert, that ones that we send out, ones that Dignity sends out, acting in those ways, I think working with your legislators to let them know this is how you think and feel as a person of faith, and owning your Catholicism when you're in those visits, also powerful ways. I think at the parish level, I think I'll let Marianne talk a little bit more about this, but be aware that there are other ways that our community has been gathering, particularly during the pandemic. There are new ways of connecting with each other that the pandemic has allowed us to have, where we are still honoring our Catholic traditions, but in ways that are more respectful sometimes than what we see in some of our traditional settings.
Yeah, the question's great, and thanks for the toss, Glenn. I would say, at the parish level, the priests are supposed to be concerned about pastoral care. I think that it's definitely every person's right to engage with the pastor, with the priest, with anyone on staff at the church. If you have concerns about what's appearing in the bulletin, what's being said from the pulpit, about actions that you see happening, it's perfectly fine to ask for an appointment or a phone call to speak with that priest, with the pastor. I always urge people to start from the pastoral implications. What you said about LGBTQ people, or about folks who have considered abortion or have had abortions, or folks who are getting divorced, is hurtful to folks. Just bring that up. You don't know how many people sitting in that church are struggling with these issues and having those experiences. That's really important. I think it's also interesting at times to have a conversation about the finances of the church, and ask how much of each week's collection is passed up to the diocesan level. And if your bishop is representing policies and practices that you don't agree, you could say, okay, I'm going to deduct that percentage from my contribution. I really want this church to have a solid roof. I want the staff to be paid. I want, whatever it is that you support, that's great. But I don't think that the bishop interfering in our state's voting laws efforts is appropriate. So I'm withholding that amount. We have to start exercising our power as Catholics. And I would also encourage that when you are engaged in the political process, you make it clear that you're doing so as a Catholic. Don't just speak as a pro-choice or a pro-equality person. Speak as a pro-choice or pro-equality Catholic, so that the politicians are not only hearing from people that, not everybody that the politicians hear from who identifies as Catholic is speaking in opposition to our beliefs.
100% agree. I think there's a lot of power in simply identifying yourself with multiple identities that you hold, and allowing people to see that you are a whole person and a combination of all of them. So saying that you're a pro-choice Catholic versus just pro-choice or a Catholic really helps them see you at the personal level and really think about the policy and how it affects people. The next question can go to anyone who feels persuaded to answer it. This was submitted. It says, as a non-Catholic person myself, how can I approach my Catholic friends to discuss what's going on? Or should I just stay in my lane and leave Catholic problems for the Catholic people?
Well, I think I go back to what I said a little bit earlier, is that Catholic problems affect everyone, because the Catholic Church is so disproportionately powerful in healthcare, in the courts, in policy, in public policy. So I think it's really important for everyone, Catholic or non-Catholic, atheist, it doesn't matter, to learn about the power of the church, and see the ways in which they're influencing, whether it's through their lobbying efforts, whether it's through all of the Catholic hospitals and clinics, where you will be denied a whole host of services, not just abortion or contraceptive access. You could be denied gender reassignment or surgeries or healthcare. You could be denied end-of-life care that is dignifying. You know, the bishops control the directives in those settings, and that affects everybody. So that's what I would say is that's one of my missions, is to educate people that Catholic or non-Catholic, this church is affecting you. It's taking away your rights. It's taking away your health care. You know, I think about the church, you know, the Catholic Church has been in the Supreme Court a lot in the last few years, trying to take away contraceptive access. That was supposedly a mandate in the Affordable Care Act. They had a victory about employment law, you know, and anyone that can be declared a minister, can be fired for any reason, not just for being LGBTQ, but for, you know, you could be fired for being old, you could be fired for being sick, you know. So that's what I would say, is to really engage in what are the real, the political and civil ramifications of the situation.
Thank you. And I believe we have time for one more question that was just submitted. Whoever wants to can answer it. Now that the Supreme Court is heavily Catholic and anti-choice, what do you think is the future of Roe versus Wade? And I will add, how do you think the bishops will respond in either scenario?
I'll start and then I'll ask for an assist from others. Yeah, I mean, we have 6 of the 9 justices are Catholic. 5 of those 6 are anti-choice. As folks may be aware, there is a case before the Supreme Court currently. And the stakes could not be higher, frankly. So, you know, I believe I'm a person of hope, and so I believe that folks will get what will get the access to the care that they need. But I think it's going to take a lot of work on the parts of all of the individuals who believe in conscience, who believe in reproductive health and rights, making their viewpoints known. And we have our work cut out both now and in the future around these issues. I think it's also well to point out that, you know, with respect to abortion access, you know, the Catholic Senator Henry Hyde, you know, abortion access for many have already struggled with access to abortion. And, you know, it was a Catholic Senator, Henry Hyde, who in 1976, you know, instituted the Hyde Amendment and basically said essentially that, you know, he couldn't restrict it for everybody. The only vehicle he had really restricted it for the poor, and he was okay with that. And so we'd be well to remember both the ways that folks currently don't have access and to continue that fight, as well as to remember the stakes that are ramped up at the current moment.
Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, the only thing I would add there is we are preparing for a post-Roe world, even though, I'll repeat this, 68% of Catholics do not want to see Roe struck down in the United States. We're preparing and we're doing several things, because if it gets struck down, it goes back to the states, and it'll be on a state-by-state basis whether or not it is legal and in what ways it's legal. So one of the things we need to do is on a state-by-state basis, go into communities and start having courageous conversations with Catholics about abortion and get them to do what the bishops refuse to allow, which is really talk and dialogue, because we have too many Catholics still voting for people like Trump strictly because of abortion, not realizing that by using that rationale, they're playing into a white supremacist Christian nationalistic agenda, ultimately, you know, that uses abortion in an exploitative way. So I think we need to do that and have those conversations. And the last thing I would say is we need to think about the Equal Rights Amendment because the Roe law has never been, it's always been a bit shaky. We need for women and people of all genders to be equal, and only the Equal Rights Amendment will guarantee that. And if we have that, then we have a much stronger basis by which to have abortion be a right, in the Constitution.
All right. Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. And with that, it's just about 2 o'clock, so our time together is coming to an end. Thank you all for being here today, for showing up, and for being willing to have these tough conversations about our church and our values. In the next day or two, you'll receive a follow-up email with a recording of today's event, links to resources, and a few ways to take action and speak up as a pro-choice Catholic. It'll also tell you how you can join our new Facebook group and become part of the awesome community that we're building there. So again, thank you for being part of our pro-choice Catholic family here at Catholics for Choice. We'll see you next time when we'll be spotlighting Latinx pro-choice Catholics and how to build an inclusive and effective movement. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.